Have you ever wondered what life was truly like for women between the years 500 and 1500 CE? Do images of helpless damsels in distress fill your mind, or women trapped in towers waiting for rescue? Get ready to flip those old dusty scripts. Number 1. Medieval women were always weak and sickly. Imagine a world where most people lived off the land, where heavy manual labor was the norm, and medical understanding was far different from what we know today. Many people tend to picture medieval women as fragile beings, constantly ill, perhaps fading away from some mysterious malady. Historical records, however, paint a more complex picture. While life expectancy was lower than it is now, and childbirth was undeniably dangerous, the women who survived childhood were often remarkably robust and physically strong. Consider the daily life of a peasant woman. Her mornings often began before dawn. She would rise, tend to the fire, prepare a simple meal for her family, and then head out to the fields. Depending on the season, this could mean sowing seeds, weeding vast stretches of crops under the hot sun, or harvesting grain. The work was backbreaking. Think about swinging a scythe or handling a heavy hoe for hours on end. This was not the work of someone delicate. Their bodies adapted to these demands. Their hands would have been calloused, their muscles toned from constant exertion. Beyond the fields, women were often responsible for managing the household economy. This was not a small task. They might spin wool into thread, weave that thread into cloth, and then sew garments for their families. They would churn butter, bake bread, brew ale, and preserve food for the long winter months. These tasks required significant physical stamina and skill. For example, operating a hand loom was a full-body workout, involving repetitive motions that built strength in the arms, back, and shoulders. Or carrying water from the well, often multiple times a day, was another strenuous chore. These were not light duties, they were essential for survival and contributed directly to the family's well-being. Records from medieval England, for instance, show women regularly participating in the hay harvest, a particularly arduous period of intensive labor. They worked alongside men, often for the same wages for the same tasks. This suggests a recognition of their physical capabilities and contribution. If they were universally weak, they would not have been able to keep up with such demands. Even among the elite, where physical labor might be less direct, women often face different kinds of physical challenges. Noblewomen might ride horses for long distances, sometimes over rough terrain as they traveled between estates or followed their husbands on campaigns. Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, for instance, journeyed across Europe and even participated in the Second Crusade, enduring the harsh conditions of travel and campaigning in the 12th century. Her journeys were not leisurely strolls, they involved considerable physical endurance and resilience. Childbirth, while a significant risk, was not the only story of a medieval woman's body. Women survived multiple births, sometimes with decades between them. They recovered from illnesses and injuries without modern medicine. Their bodies were accustomed to a life of physical activity, which often provided a baseline of health that helped them withstand the challenges of their environment. While disease and famine could sweep through communities, affecting everyone, the individual strength and endurance of many medieval women allowed them to persist through incredible hardship, adapting and thriving in a world that demanded much from them. They were not merely surviving, they were actively shaping their lives and environments through their physical capabilities. Their everyday existence was a testament to strength and endurance, a stark contrast to the common portrayal of universal frailty. Number 2. Medieval women were always confined to the home. Many people think medieval women were just stuck inside, never seeing the light of day, only tending to children and hearth. This image often comes from later historical periods or from a focus solely on the wealthiest noblewomen. But for the vast majority of medieval women, life was far more active and involved a wide range of activities outside the domestic sphere. Their lives were deeply woven into the economic and social fabric of their communities. Think about the sheer necessity of work in the Middle Ages. Most people lived in rural areas, and everyone had to contribute to provide food, shelter, and clothing. This meant that women, alongside men, worked in the fields. We already touched on this a little. They plowed, sowed, weeded, and harvested. A peasant woman's day might begin in her small cottage, but it would quickly move to the open fields, the village common, or the nearby woods. They gathered firewood, fetched water from the well or river, and tended to livestock like chickens, pigs, or goats that often roamed freely. These tasks demanded they be outside, interacting with the environment and other villagers. Beyond agriculture, women were deeply involved in a vast array of trades and crafts. In towns and cities, women could be found working as brewers, bakers, spinners, weavers, dyers, embroiderers, innkeepers, mercers, sellers of fine fabrics, and shopkeepers. Guild records from various European cities show women listed as members of guilds, sometimes as masters of their craft, indicating they owned and operated their own businesses. In Paris, for example, guild statutes from the 13th century mention women running businesses as silk workers, embroiderers, and even poulterers, selling poultry in the markets. These women would have traveled to markets, negotiated prices, managed apprentices, and overseen production. Their daily work took them into the bustling streets, interacting with customers and suppliers, far from the confines of a private dwelling. Consider the example of the brewster or female brewer. Ale was a staple drink, consumed by everyone, and brewing was often a woman's domain. Now, these women would have purchased grains, managed brewing equipment, and then sold their product. Their homes often doubled as their shops, meaning customers came to them, but also that their work was visible and public. They weren't just homemakers, they were entrepreneurs running vital businesses that provided essential goods to their communities. Even women in more privileged positions, like noblewomen or abbesses, were not necessarily confined. Noblewomen often managed large estates when their husbands were away at war or on political duties. This involved overseeing agricultural production, collecting rents, administering justice, and managing a large household staff. They would travel between their various landholdings, inspecting properties, and engaging with tenants. Abbesses, the heads of convents, managed vast estates, exercised spiritual authority over their nuns, and often had significant political influence. They engaged with kings, bishops, and other powerful figures, traveling to councils or important meetings, directing building projects, and overseeing economic enterprises. For example, Hildegard of Bingen, a German abbess in the 12th century, traveled widely to preach and consult with religious and political leaders. Her life was certainly not confined to the walls of her convent. She engaged with the outside world, expressing her opinions and exercising considerable authority. Our women also traveled for pilgrimages, visiting holy sites across Europe. This was a common and important activity that took them far from their homes for extended periods, sometimes in groups, sometimes alone. The roads of medieval Europe were filled with people, and women were a significant part of that movement. Their journeys were not just about spiritual devotion, they were also about exposure to different places, cultures, and people. So, while a focus on domestic duties was important for many, it rarely meant complete isolation or confinement. Medieval women were active participants in the economic, social, and spiritual life of their times, constantly moving and engaging with the world around them. Their contributions were too vital to be limited to the inside of a house. Number 3, medieval women were uneducated and illiterate. It is a widespread belief that women in the Middle Ages were almost entirely uneducated, unable to read or write, and thus cut off from intellectual life. While formal schooling was certainly not as widespread as it is today, and literacy rates overall were lower than in modern times, many medieval women across different social classes did indeed acquire education, read, and even write, shaping their own intellectual lives and contributing to the era's culture. The type and extent of education varied greatly depending on social standing and religious affiliation. For women in the upper classes, education often took place at home through tutors or sometimes in convents. While noble daughters were taught skills necessary for managing a large household, including arithmetic for estate management, basic Latin, and often reading and writing in their vernacular language. They might also learn history, poetry, and sometimes even a bit of law. Books, though expensive, were treasured possessions, and access to them was a marker of status and learning. Consider the case of Christine de Pizan, born in Venice in 1364, but living most of her life in France. She was a remarkable author and intellectual. Her father, a scholar, ensured she received an excellent education, far surpassing what was typical for a woman of her time. After her husband's death, she became a professional writer to support her family, a career almost unheard of for a woman. She wrote numerous works, including The Book of the City of Ladies, a powerful defense of women and their capabilities, using historical and mythological examples of accomplished women. Christine de Pizan's life demonstrates that not only could women be educated, but they could also become prominent literary figures, engaging in intellectual debates and influencing public discourse. For women in religious orders, particularly nuns, education was a core component of their life. Convents were centers of learning, where women learned to read and write Latin, the language of scripture and scholarly texts. They copied manuscripts, created illuminated texts, and engaged in theological study. Some abbesses were celebrated scholars and authors. We already mentioned Hildegard of Bingen, but she stands out as a prime example. She was not just a manager of a convent, she was a polymath who wrote extensively on theology, medicine, natural science, and composed hymns and morality plays. Her works demonstrate a deep understanding of scripture, philosophy, and the world around her, proving that women could be intellectual powerhouses. Even outside the elite and religious spheres, practical literacy existed, and daughters of merchants and artisans might learn basic reading, writing, and arithmetic to help with the family business. They needed to keep accounts, write letters to suppliers, and manage inventories. While perhaps not receiving a formal classical education, this practical literacy was vital for their economic activity and demonstrated a functional level of learning. For example, business records from the Florentine merchant families sometimes show women signing documents or keeping ledgers. Not all literacy involved books. Many women learned through oral tradition, memorizing vast amounts of religious lore, ballads, and stories. They absorbed knowledge through sermons, plays, and public readings. This form of cultural literacy was incredibly important, shaping their understanding of the world and their place within it. While it is true that universal formal education was not a feature of the Middle Ages for anyone, male or female, the idea that medieval women were universally ignorant or unlettered simply does not hold up to historical scrutiny. Many women were educated to varying degrees, some even to an exceptional level, and they played crucial roles in the intellectual, artistic, and literary life of their societies, challenging the notion of a dark age for female minds. They actively participated in the creation and transmission of knowledge. Number 4. Medieval women had no power or influence. The idea that medieval women were entirely powerless, subjugated figures is a persistent myth, perhaps because we often look for power in forms that align with modern political structures. However, when we consider the diverse ways power and influence manifested in the Middle Ages, it becomes clear that many women wielded considerable authority, both formally and informally, shaping events, policies, and the lives of those around them. The most obvious examples come from the ranks of royalty and nobility. Queens were not just decorative consorts. They often played crucial roles in governance, acting as regents for underage sons, managing royal finances, conducting diplomacy, and even leading armies. Eleanor of Aquitaine, who we mentioned before, is an outstanding example. As Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, she was a powerful feudal lord before she married first the King of France, Louis VII, and later the King of England, Henry II. She actively participated in ruling both kingdoms, exercised her own legal rights, and even led a rebellion against her husband, Henry II. Her sons, including Richard the Lionheart and King John, were deeply influenced by her. She traveled extensively, mediated disputes, and maintained a wide network of political alliances. Her life demonstrates the immense power a queen could wield, even in a patriarchal society. Another striking example is Blanche of Castile, who served as regent for her son Louis IX of France during his minority in the 13th century. She was a highly effective ruler, suppressing rebellions, negotiating treaties, and strengthening the French monarchy. Her political acumen and strong will were undeniable, and she commanded the respect and fear of powerful nobles. Beyond the formal power of queens, noblewomen managed vast estates. With their husbands frequently away at war, crusades, or court, these women were responsible for the economic prosperity and defense of their lands. They administered justice in local courts, oversaw agricultural production, managed household accounts, and commanded the loyalty of their vassals and servants. This was not a ceremonial role. It required strong administrative skills, decisive leadership, and often the ability to project authority in a rough and tumble world. The running of a medieval manor was a complex undertaking, and many noblewomen proved themselves highly capable estate managers. In the religious sphere, abbesses of powerful convents held significant authority. They were spiritual leaders, but also temporal lords, managing extensive land holdings, collecting rents, and sometimes even holding their own courts. They often exercised jurisdiction over entire villages and commanded considerable wealth and influence. For example, the Abbess of Chelles in France was a prominent figure, engaging in complex legal disputes and maintaining relations with kings and popes. These women were not just confined to prayer, they were powerful administrators and political players. Even for women lower down the social ladder, influence was not entirely absent. The women were active in urban guilds, sometimes as masters, meaning they had a voice in setting standards, training apprentices, and governing their trade. They participated in town councils and local courts, sometimes as plaintiffs, sometimes as witnesses, and sometimes even as jurors in specific cases. Women often held respected positions within their communities as midwives, healers, or skilled craftswomen, whose knowledge and abilities were valued and sought after. In the daily life of a village, the good wife or mistress of a household held considerable sway within her family and often within her immediate community. She managed the domestic economy, raised children, and often ran a small side business like brewing or selling eggs. Her reputation and skills contributed to the standing of her family. Women also exercised influence through their social networks, through gossip, and through the informal channels of communication that were so vital in a world without mass media. Their opinions and judgments mattered in the daily interactions of village or town life. So, while medieval women certainly faced limitations and societal expectations, it is far from accurate to say they had no power or influence. Their authority manifested in diverse ways, from queens ruling kingdoms to abbesses managing vast estates, from noblewomen defending castles to women running successful businesses in bustling towns. They were active agents in their own lives and within their communities, shaping the course of history in countless ways, often quietly, sometimes dramatically. Their impact was undeniable, even if it often goes unnoticed in traditional historical narratives. Number 5. Medieval women's only purpose was childbearing. A common perception is that a medieval woman's entire existence revolved around marriage and the production of children, especially male heirs. This view often overlooks the rich tapestry of roles women fulfilled beyond motherhood and ignores the fact that not all women married or had children. While childbearing was certainly an important aspect of many women's lives and vital for the continuation of families and lineages, it was far from their singular purpose. Firstly, many women chose or were destined for a religious life, entering convents as nuns. For these women, their purpose was spiritual devotion, intellectual pursuit, and community service. They took vows of chastity, specifically foregoing marriage and children. As we discussed, convents were centers of learning, art, and even political influence. Nuns dedicated their lives to prayer, manuscript illumination, copying texts, caring for the sick, and teaching. Their contributions to medieval society were significant, not tied to their reproductive capacity. For example, the women of Barking Abbey in England were known for their scholarship and their contributions to the liturgy. Their lives were purposeful and meaningful without the dimension of motherhood. Secondly, economic realities often dictated that women, whether married or single, engage in productive labor that contributed directly to the family or household economy. For peasant women, this meant working in the fields managing livestock and producing essential goods like cloth and food. For urban women, it meant running businesses, engaging in crafts, or working as servants. These roles were not just supplementary, they were often central to the survival and prosperity of the household. A woman's skill as a weaver, a brewer, or a baker could be as crucial to the family's well-being as her ability to bear children. Their economic contribution was a primary purpose. Consider the role of the single woman. Not every woman married. Some remained single due to choice, economic circumstance, or the death of a prospective spouse. These women often had more autonomy over their lives and property than married women. They could own land, run businesses, and engage in legal transactions independently. Their purpose was self-sufficiency and often contributing to the wider community through their labor or skills. For example, many single women worked as servants, wet nurses, or in various trades, creating their own economic security and purpose outside of marriage and family. Even for married women who bore children, their lives were not solely defined by this role. They were educators for their children, often responsible for their early moral and practical training. They were managers of the household, a complex and demanding job that involved budgeting, overseeing servants, maintaining supplies, and often caring for the sick. They were partners in their marriages, often advising their husbands on business or estate matters. The famed Paston letters from 15th century England show women like Margaret Paston actively managing their family's estates, dealing with legal disputes, and communicating vital information to their absent husbands. Her letters reveal a woman deeply engaged in the running of the family's affairs, a purpose far beyond simply bearing children. Furthermore, not all women were able to have children or survive childbirth. For those who did not, their lives certainly did not lose meaning or purpose. They still contributed to their families and communities in myriad ways, adapting to their circumstances. Barrenness, while sometimes seen as a misfortune, did not necessarily define a woman's entire identity or eliminate her value in society. In essence, medieval society, despite its emphasis on family and lineage, also recognized the diverse contributions of women across various spheres. Their purposes extended far beyond just childbearing to include economic productivity, spiritual devotion, intellectual pursuits, and household management. To reduce their existence to a single biological function is to erase the rich and varied lives of millions of women who shaped the Middle Ages in countless ways. They were individuals with multiple roles and purposes, just like people in any era. Number 6, medieval women were always passive and submissive. The image of the docile, endlessly submissive medieval woman, always obeying male authority without question, is deeply ingrained in popular imagination. This idea often ignores the ways women asserted themselves, resisted oppression, and actively pursued their own interests, sometimes subtly, sometimes overtly. While societal norms certainly pushed for female obedience and deference, the historical record is filled with examples of women who were anything but passive. Consider the legal system. Despite the limitations of medieval law, which often placed women under the guardianship of their fathers, husbands, or brothers, women frequently used the courts to protect their rights and property. They appeared as plaintiffs, bringing lawsuits against those who wronged them, whether it was to recover debts, claim inheritances, or seek justice for assault. They defended themselves against accusations and testified as witnesses. For example, court rolls from medieval England show women engaging in a wide variety of legal disputes, demonstrating their knowledge of legal procedures and their willingness to fight for their rights. A woman who is passive would not initiate a lawsuit. Resistance could also take more direct forms. Women participated in peasant revolts, alongside men demanding better conditions or protesting injustice. During the Jacquerie in France in 1358 or the Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381, women were active participants in the uprisings, sometimes even leading groups or engaging in violent acts against authorities. They were not just followers, they had their own grievances and agency. Their presence in these large-scale movements challenges any notion of universal passivity. Within their households, women found ways to exert influence and agency. As household managers, they made daily decisions about resources, labor, and domestic affairs. Their wives often managed the household finances, a role that required independence and decision-making. The Paston letters again illustrate this well. Margaret Paston was not a submissive figure. She was a forceful personality, negotiating, defending her family's property, and even facing armed attacks, all while her husband was absent. Her actions show a woman who was assertive, resourceful, and capable of taking charge in challenging situations. Women also found ways to challenge male authority through social and cultural means. In literature and popular culture, medieval women were sometimes portrayed as cunning, witty, or even rebellious figures, often outsmarting men. Think of the wife of Bath in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, a strong, independent woman who openly challenges traditional views on marriage and female roles. While a fictional character, she reflects contemporary perceptions of women who defied expectations. Such literary representations suggest a societal awareness of women who were not simply submissive. Religious life offered women a powerful avenue for self-assertion. Mystics like Julian of Norwich in 14th century England or Catherine of Siena in 14th century Italy, while operating within religious frameworks, expressed powerful theological insights and challenged conventional interpretations of scripture and authority. They attracted followers, advised popes and kings, and left behind profound written works. Their spiritual authority gave them a voice that transcended conventional gender roles, demonstrating immense personal strength and an unwillingness to be silenced. Even in situations where women were clearly subordinate, they could employ subtle forms of resistance, known as everyday forms of resistance. This could involve foot-dragging, feigned ignorance, gossiping, or covert defiance. These meant that you have as a kid, because as a kid, you're looking around, you're going, oh, I wonder what's on top of the clouds, or I wonder how a rainbow forms. So while societal expectations might have dictated a certain level of deference, medieval women were far from passive. They fought for their rights in court, participated in rebellions, managed complex households, ran businesses, expressed powerful spiritual and intellectual ideas, and found countless ways to assert their agency and influence their world. Their stories are not of endless submission, but of dynamic engagement and often courageous defiance in the face of restrictive norms. Number 7. Medieval women had no control over their bodies or sexuality. It is a common belief that medieval women were entirely without agency concerning their own bodies and sexual lives, seen merely as property or vessels for reproduction. While the control men exercised over women in various spheres was undeniable, and a woman's sexual reputation was critically important, a closer look at historical evidence reveals surprising nuances in instances where women exerted significant, if often constrained, control over their bodies and choices. Marriage, often arranged for economic or political reasons, was a central institution. However, the Church, particularly from the 12th century onwards, increasingly emphasized the importance of mutual consent for a marriage to be valid. While parental pressure was enormous, a woman could, theoretically, refuse to marry someone she did not consent to, rendering the marriage null in the eyes of the Church. This legal principle, though often difficult to enforce in practice, gave women a powerful, if sometimes risky, bargaining chip. If a woman was forced into a marriage, she could appeal to ecclesiastical courts for annulment. This was not a power to choose a spouse freely, but it was a power to reject one against her will. As regarding contraception and abortion, while the church condemned such practices, their existence is well documented, suggesting women actively sought to control their fertility. Medical texts and folk remedies from the period describe various concoctions and methods believed to prevent conception or induce abortion. These practices, often passed down through female networks, demonstrate a practical, if dangerous, attempt by women to regulate their own bodies and reproductive lives, often out of desperation to limit the number of pregnancies or to avoid unwanted children. The very existence of prohibitions against these practices implies that women were indeed engaging in them. Prostitution, though condemned morally by the church, was often tolerated and even regulated by medieval towns. For some women, this was a difficult and often dangerous livelihood, but for others, it represented a form of economic independence or an escape from other difficult circumstances. Brothels were often licensed and taxed by municipal authorities, suggesting a pragmatic recognition of this practice. While not an ideal choice, it provided some women with an alternative to marriage or servitude and a degree of control over their bodies, however precarious. Women also held significant roles in the healing arts, particularly as midwives and healers. These women had intimate knowledge of the female body, childbirth, and herbal remedies. They assisted women through pregnancy and labor, and were often the primary medical providers for women in their communities. Their expertise gave them a unique position of authority and trust regarding women's health, allowing for a female-centered approach to bodily care that was often outside male control. Within marriage, the concept of conjugal debt existed, meaning both husband and wife owed each other sexual relations. While this could be used to force a woman, it also meant that a woman could, in theory, demand her husband fulfill his conjugal duties and even use refusal of sex as a form of leverage within the relationship. This was a complex dynamic, but it shows that the sexual sphere was not entirely one-sided. Finally, the control of a woman's body was also evident in the sphere of spiritual devotion. Women who chose to become nuns made a conscious decision to dedicate their bodies and lives to God, explicitly rejecting marital relations and the secular world. This was a powerful act of self-determination, an assertion of control over their physical and spiritual selves, freely choosing a path that excluded marriage and motherhood and instead focused on asceticism and intellectual pursuits. While societal structures were overwhelmingly patriarchal and women faced immense pressures regarding marriage, chastity, and reproduction, the historical record shows that medieval women were not simply passive recipients of male will. They found various ways, both overt and covert, to exert agency over their bodies, their sexual lives, and their reproductive futures. Their choices, though constrained, were nonetheless present, revealing a more nuanced reality than the popular myths suggest. Number 8. Medieval women lacked strong emotional connections and love. The notion that love and deep emotional bonds were rare or non-existent in medieval marriages, which are often portrayed as purely transactional arrangements for property or status, is a pervasive myth. This perception often stems from focusing solely on elite marriages and overlooking the rich emotional lives evident in personal letters, legal documents, and literary works from the period. While practicality certainly played a role in marriage, genuine affection, companionship, and even passion were far from absent. For the majority of the population, particularly peasants and artisans, marriage was often less about grand alliances and more about forming an economic unit. Yet, even in these pragmatic unions, companionship and affection naturally grew. Your husbands and wives worked side by side, sharing the burdens and joys of daily life. They raised children together, faced hardships, and celebrated successes. This shared experience often fostered strong bonds of mutual respect and affection. Accounts of peasant life often describe partnerships where spouses relied heavily on each other for survival and well-being, leading to deep attachments. Personal letters, though scarce, provide precious glimpses into the emotional lives of medieval couples. The Paston letters, which we have mentioned repeatedly for good reason, are a treasure trove in this regard. The correspondence between John Paston and his wife Margaret, for example, reveals a relationship built on trust, mutual support, and genuine concern. John often addresses Margaret with affection, signing his letters "Your true and loving husband." Margaret, in turn, diligently manages family affairs, expresses concern for his well-being, and shares news of their children. Their letters show them discussing practical matters, but also sharing worries and affection, demonstrating a deep emotional connection that defies the idea of a purely utilitarian marriage. Literary works, while not always direct historical accounts, reflect societal ideals and emotions. Courtly love, though an idealized concept, celebrated passionate devotion and intense emotional connection, even if often outside the confines of marriage. More broadly, religious and moral texts frequently praise marital fidelity and the importance of a harmonious household, implying that affection within marriage was a desired and achievable state. Medieval romances, while fantastical, often centered on themes of enduring love and devotion, which resonated with contemporary audiences. Even in arranged marriages among the elite, while the initial motivation might have been strategic, personal relationships often developed over time. Couples who spent years together, raised children, and shared a life often formed strong bonds. The chronicler Jean Froissart, writing in the 14th century, describes various noble couples with genuine affection, noting how they grieved deeply for one another upon death. The practice of wives following their husbands on campaigns or pilgrimages also suggests a desire for companionship and shared experience. Furthermore, love extended beyond the spousal relationship. The deep bonds between mothers and children are evident in countless historical records, from epitaphs mourning lost children to legal documents where women fought fiercely for their children's inheritance or welfare. The profound grief expressed by women who lost children, often to disease, shows an intense emotional attachment. Similarly, the love and loyalty between siblings, or between women and their extended family networks, are well documented. Friendship was also a highly valued bond. Women formed strong friendships with other women, often providing crucial emotional support, practical help, and companionship in a world that could be challenging. These female networks were vital for sharing knowledge, raising children, and navigating social life. So, while medieval life was certainly different from ours and societal norms around marriage and family were often strict, it is inaccurate to assume an absence of love or deep emotional connections. For humans have always sought connection, affection, and companionship. Medieval women, like people in any era, experienced the full spectrum of human emotion, forming loving bonds with their spouses, children, family, and friends, navigating their world not as unfeeling automatons, but as individuals with rich and complex emotional lives. Their capacity for love and connection was as strong and vital as it is today. Number 9, medieval women's clothing was always restrictive and uncomfortable. When people think of medieval women's clothing, images of corsets, heavy layered gowns, and elaborate headwear that seem utterly impractical and uncomfortable often come to mind. While some aspects of medieval fashion could be restrictive, especially for noble women on formal occasions, for the vast majority of medieval women, clothing was designed primarily for practicality, warmth, and the demands of their daily lives. The idea that their entire wardrobe was a torture device is largely a myth. For peasant women, comfort and functionality were paramount. Their clothing consisted of simple tunics or shifts made of linen, worn close to the body, often topped with a loose, long dress or gown made of wool. These garments were generally unfitted, allowing for ease of movement necessary for agricultural labor, household chores, and other physically demanding activities. They were designed to be durable, easy to clean, though frequent washing was not always practical, and adaptable to different weather conditions. Layers could be added or removed for warmth or coolness. Head coverings, like wimples or simple veils, were common, often for modesty, and to protect hair from dirt, sun, and cold, but these were typically light and allowed for full range of motion. Their shoes were generally soft leather turn shoes, more like slippers, which allowed for flexibility and direct ground contact, though not always waterproof. Even for wealthier women, everyday clothing was often more comfortable than what we imagine. While formal court attire might involve more elaborate construction, the underlying garments were still relatively practical. A cotehardie, for example, a popular dress in the 14th century, could be fitted, but it was not boned like later corsets. The shaping came from careful tailoring, and the fabrics were natural, allowing for breathability. Sleeves varied, but were often wide or designed to allow movement. Headwear, while sometimes elaborate for the nobility, also served practical purposes. Veils and wimples kept hair tidy and protected it. Later, towering hennons or elaborate horned headdresses were indeed part of high fashion, but these were worn for specific occasions, not for daily work. Imagine trying to harvest crops in a hennon. These showpieces were a sign of status and wealth, and their inconvenience was part of their appeal, demonstrating that the wearer did not have to perform manual labor. But they were not representative of the average woman's attire. The notion of a medieval corset in the modern sense is largely anachronistic. What might appear as a restrictive garment was more often a simple lacing of a dress or an undergarment designed to provide support or create a desired silhouette without the rigid boning of later periods. The primary focus was on layering and draping rather than extreme constriction. Consider the materials themselves. Wool and linen were the most common fabrics. For wool, while heavy, was incredibly warm and durable, essential in drafty medieval homes in cold climates. Linen was breathable and absorbent, ideal for undergarments. These natural fibers, unlike some synthetic ones today, allowed the skin to breathe, making them more comfortable for prolonged wear, even if they sometimes felt bulky. Of course, comfort is relative. Medieval people did not have the same expectations of softness or stretch that we do today, but their clothing evolved to suit their lives. A woman working in a busy medieval market, a nun engaged in copying manuscripts, or a noblewoman riding across her estate needed to be able to move freely and perform their duties. Their clothing reflected this need for functionality. It was designed to provide warmth, protection, and practicality, allowing women to engage in their diverse roles rather than hindering them. So the next time you picture a medieval woman, think less of a tightly laced, suffocating figure, and more of someone dressed for the realities of a physically demanding and active life. Number 10. Life was uniformly miserable for all medieval women. The popular image of the Middle Ages often paints a bleak picture, a period of constant hardship, disease, poverty, and oppression, where life was universally grim, especially for women. While it is true that medieval life involved significant challenges, famines, plagues, wars, and high mortality rates were realities for everyone, to characterize all women's lives as uniformly miserable is a vast oversimplification. Human experience, then as now, was incredibly diverse, shaped by social class, geographic location, individual circumstances, and personal agency. Moments of joy, community, security, and personal fulfillment were undeniably part of the medieval woman's world. Consider the sheer variety of experiences based on social standing. The life of a peasant woman, while hard, was fundamentally different from that of a noblewoman, a nun, or a merchant's wife. A peasant woman might face relentless physical labor and precarious subsistence, but she also experienced the rhythms of agricultural life, the closeness of village community, religious festivals, and the joys of family. Her sorrows were real, but so were her simple pleasures: a good harvest, the birth of a healthy child, a warm fire on a cold night, communal celebrations, dancing, and storytelling. These were not insignificant moments. For a noblewoman, while she might have avoided the daily grind of manual labor, her life might involve political intrigue, forced marriages, the burden of managing large estates, and the constant fear of war or invasion. Yet, she also had access to education, fine clothing, varied diets, social networks, and opportunities for influence that a peasant woman could only dream of. The lady of the castle had servants, could travel, and might engage in pursuits like falconry or embroidery. Her miserable was different from a peasant's miserable. Religious life offered a distinct path. Nuns, for example, lived a structured life of prayer and communal living. While demanding, convents could provide refuge from the secular world, opportunities for intellectual pursuit, sisterhood, and a sense of purpose. For some women, this was a choice made for genuine spiritual devotion, offering peace and fulfillment rather than an escape from misery. They found joy in their faith, their community, and their scholarship. A community was a vital aspect of medieval life and a significant source of support and joy. And women lived in close-knit villages and towns, participating in communal work, celebrating together, and relying on each other in times of need. Births, marriages, and religious festivals were occasions for feasting, music, and socializing. The bonds of kinship and friendship provided emotional resilience and support, helping individuals navigate hardship. Women formed strong networks, sharing knowledge, assisting in childbirth, and providing mutual aid. This sense of belonging and collective support was a powerful antidote to isolation and despair. Even in the face of widespread challenges like plague, which undeniably caused immense suffering, communities often pulled together, displaying remarkable resilience. While individual lives were tragically cut short, those who survived adapted and rebuilt, finding ways to continue. This is not to diminish the profound losses, but to highlight the human capacity for adaptation and the enduring presence of hope and purpose. Love, companionship, and personal relationships, as we discussed before, were certainly present. The bonds within families, between spouses, and among friends provided emotional sustenance and meaning. Laughter, storytelling, games, and music were all part of daily life, offering relief and pleasure. Her children, despite high mortality rates, were loved and cherished. The simple joys of life, a good meal, the warmth of the sun, the beauty of nature, were experienced and valued. So, while medieval life was undeniably tough in many respects, portraying it as uniformly miserable for all women ignores the vast spectrum of human experience, the specific context of social class and geography, and the undeniable presence of joy, community, agency, and personal fulfillment. Medieval women, like all people throughout history, found moments of happiness, built meaningful lives, and demonstrated incredible resilience in the face of adversity. Their lives were complex tapestries woven with threads of both hardship and happiness, reflecting the enduring human spirit.